Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I use my fabric in slow stitching to make a good solid base. I'll show you 7 ways that I can prepare it to make it stronger or a little more solid to use as the basis for my slow stitching. Now from there, I can add stitches, I can add additional fabric, trim, beads, anything goes. But it's really the skeletal structure of my pieces. So let's get started. So to prepare my fabric for slow stitching, I don't typically iron it unless it needs it. This fabric is kind of on the fence of whether it needs to be ironed for me, so I will iron it. Most of the fabric, though, that I have stored doesn't require ironing. Some people ask if I launder the fabric, and I don't tend to launder the fabric unless I'm using it as a functional piece. And the reason I launder it before I use it as something functional is because if it's functional, it's going to be washed at some point, and I want to make sure that if it shrinks or if the color bleeds, it does so before I've put in all the time and effort into my project. But for most of my projects, I just use cotton fabric, and I prefer cotton fabric to fabric that has any other synthetic materials mixed in, whether it's polyester or rayon. I'll still use those fabrics if I really love them, but for the most part, 99% of my work, I use cotton fabrics. The beauty of cotton fabrics is they feel so nice to stitch through. The downside to cotton fabrics is they come in different weights, so some are a lot more flimsy than others. And if you have a small piece and you want to stitch on it, well, it can be very hard to work with. So there are different techniques that I use to give my fabric more body. So sometimes when you're hand stitching, you're doing your slow stitching, you'll have a piece of fabric that's very lightweight. If the piece of fabric is large enough, you can hand stitch it. It might require some pins or some adhesive to hold it in place, but particularly if there are additional fabric layers, you can usually make do. But sometimes that doesn't work. So there are 7 options for you. If you're committed to using lightweight fabric, first thing you can do is get an embroidery hoop. Now this is a larger hoop. If I wanted to use an embroidery hoop on this piece, I would have to find a smaller one. But to use the embroidery hoop, it has that little tension, and you just find your fabric and your embroidery hoop, the pieces, the sizes that match. So this is a very large piece of fabric, but the idea is you put it over the hoop, and then you put your larger hoop up top, and then you'll tighten it. Now I know a lot of seamstresses use it this way, so it's perfectly acceptable to use it the opposite way, where I put my larger piece underneath and my smaller piece on top to get that tension. And then I'll tighten it that way. Some people find that they can stitch to the edge a little bit better. So there's really many options. If I was to use this piece of fabric with this hoop, I'd cut it down to size. Makes it easier to work with. But that's how you'd use an embroidery hoop. And even though it's still thin fabric, you have more tension and you have something to hold on to. So that makes it easier and more comfortable to stitch through your fabric. So that's one option. Another option that you have is to choose a thicker piece of fabric. Fabrics come in all different weights. They're not usually marked, although some are, particularly with the muslin types. But one quick test is if it's transparent or you can see through it, it's a good bet that it's very lightweight. So if you're buying fabric with the intention of slow stitching, try and make sure you get a heavier fabric. The next option you have is to take your fabric and double layer it. And you can use just a second piece of the identical fabric, because in a lot of cases that might be the easiest thing that you can do, is just double up your fabric. You can also buy some lighter weight muslin, or if you already have it, and use that as your second layer of fabric and just stitch through both layers very simply. Now you don't have to use specific fabric, although you certainly can, but there's other fabric that you can use for that second layer. You can use a piece of denim if you want it to be particularly stiff. And this is just an old pair of jeans that I cut up so that I can use the denim. So that would work. You could use a piece of felt. Some people really enjoy the feel of stitching through felt. It's not going to fray, so that will give you a little more body to your piece. And the same thing with using flannel or whatnot. You can just pin it in place and continue about your stitching. Now, one option that I really like using, and I'll purchase this quilted fabric in bulk so that I have it, is to use the quilted fabric. It comes in various colors, from different natural colors, beiges and taupes and off-whites, to white. I buy it in bulk because I love the feel of stitching through this fabric. It has a lot of body and it's very nice to use. It doesn't matter what color it is. Here's where I stitch through it with just stitches, just an example. And it's just such a nice feel. I don't even need an embroidery hoop because it has that little stiffness. And here's another example where I just stitch through it, adding additional fabric as I go, and it's just a nice piece. I really enjoy sewing with this. To this effect, you don't have to purchase specific quilted fabric. If you have an old quilt or you find an old damaged quilt at a thrift store or something, use that as your quilted fabric, and that will work out nicely as well. Now, if I want to use a specific fabric and I don't want to use the quilted fabric, or I'm out of the quilted fabric, I'll use a piece of cotton batting. Batting comes in different fibers. I prefer the feel of the cotton. You can get it in an artificial like polyester, and that gives your piece bulk. You just cut it down to size. You could even tailor it to specific sizes. So if I wanted to make these flowers really puff out, I could cut a small piece of this batting, the size and shape of this flower, and tuck it in and stitch around it. So that's kind of interesting. The batting can be purchased by the yard at fabric stores, or you can purchase it in little packages. This one's made for like a baby quilt size. I think it's called a craft size. But there are various sizes. You can get a queen size or a twin. And that's how I do it. I usually buy a package, and the package will last me a few months. Now the way it looks is you have your stitching. I have my fabric, the blue fabric background. I added my stitches. Then I added a piece of this painted denim. And as you can see, it's just stitched nicely, and it almost laminates just with all the stitches to my piece. I didn't use any adhesive to hold it down. Another option to make your fabric a little stiffer is to use some stabilizer. Now this is non-woven stabilizer. You can buy it by the yard. You can buy it in a roll like I have here. I just buy a small roll because I don't need large pieces. But if you wanted to buy a yard of it, go right ahead. Use whatever is most convenient for you. This non-woven stabilizer cuts just with a pair of scissors to whatever shape I want. It doesn't fray, and you don't have to heat it or adhere it to your piece. You just pin it as if it was fabric itself. You can get iron-on stabilizer if you prefer it to be flush and attached to your fabric. But I like this non-woven, non-iron-on piece because I can cut it to size. So if I was only stitching strips, we'll say, I would just cut strips down and put it underneath the areas where I need that reinforcement. Or if I was stitching around this flower, for example, I just cut my stabilizer a little larger than the flower, place it underneath, and that would give me a little bit of body if I wanted to stitch around that flower. So that's how I use the non-woven stabilizer. Now the last method is a little messy. It's not ideal, at least in my repertoire, but it does have its place. And that is using spray starch. So I purchased a can of this. It lasts me for years. You shake it up really well, and you have your iron set to the setting of your fabric. And then I just do some light sprays in a ventilated area onto my fabric, and I like to do both sides of my fabric. And then I just give it time to absorb into that fabric, and sometimes I'll help it along by just pressing it in. Now, as I mentioned, the spray starch is a little messy, and it does tend to gum up the iron and the ironing mat. I need to just clean it with a damp cloth and an iron as well. But it is a valuable tool if you want to stiffen your fabric. And this gives it just a little more body. And then I just iron over it after the starch has permeated that fabric. I iron over both sides, and then I wait for it to dry. If the fabric isn't stiff enough, then I'll spray it again and iron it again. And as you can see, it's steaming. indicating that it's cooking and getting ready to go. The fabric is very hot after I iron it, so it's not ideal for me, but it is an important tool to have in your sewing repertoire. I find it pretty amazing to think that there were a whole generation of housewives and people who starched shirts on a regular basis, particularly the collars of the shirts, to make them nice and crisp. Got to give them a lot of credit. They really took the time to take care of their family. So this is how the fabric is a little bit stiffer now with just one coating than this, the original fabric and the one with the starch. So these are the methods that I use to make sure my fabric has a nice structure. It's firm enough to support either the additional fabric or beads or trim that I want to put on it, or it just makes it a little more easy to work with. Because after all, that's what slow stitching is about, is really truly enjoying the process. What are some methods that you use if you want to use a particular fabric and it needs to be reinforced? Comment below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.